What if the Egypt we've come to know through textbooks and museums is only part of the story, and perhaps the most distorted part? For centuries, ancient Egypt has been portrayed as a Mediterranean marvel, disconnected from the rest of Africa. Yet mounting archaeological, linguistic, and cultural evidence tells a different narrative, one in which Egypt, or Kemet, was not only geographically African, but profoundly shaped by Black African civilizations. In this video, we will examine the African foundations of Egyptian spirituality, the undeniable links between Kemet and Nubia, and the visual and cultural evidence that connects Egypt to the broader African world. By the end, you'll understand why reclaiming Egypt as a Black African civilization isn't just historically accurate, it's essential for restoring a truthful global narrative. Stay with us as we uncover what mainstream history chose to omit. For centuries, the dominant narrative about ancient Egypt has been shaped by Eurocentric historians who sought to disconnect Egypt from its African roots. By highlighting supposed links to Greece and Rome, these narratives obscured the truth that Egypt was, and remains, a Black African civilization. This erasure was not accidental. It served to promote a worldview that denied African contributions to human history, science, and spirituality. This whitewashing of Egyptian history took many forms. In museums, Egyptian statues were displayed with missing noses, subtly erasing their African features. In textbooks, Egyptians were depicted with light skin, distinct from their Nubian neighbors. Films and media further reinforce this image, portraying pharaohs and gods with European actors. These choices reflect a cultural agenda more than historical accuracy. Yet, modern scholarship, particularly from African and diaspora researchers, has begun to challenge and dismantle these myths. Through archaeology, linguistics, and comparative cultural studies, these scholars have re-established Egypt's African identity. They have shown that the people of Kemet spoke an Afro-Asiatic language, worshipped in ways consistent with African traditions, and interacted constantly with other African societies. Moreover, African spiritual traditions preserved in the Americas, through systems like Candomblé, Vodun, and Ifa, retain symbols and deities that echo those of ancient Egypt. The presence of ancestor veneration, elemental worship, and divine duality in these practices points to a shared cultural memory. Even after centuries of enslavement and displacement, African descendants have kept fragments of Kemet alive in ritual, rhythm, and reverence. This modern recognition is not just academic, it's deeply personal and political. For people of African descent, reclaiming Egypt is a form of healing, restoring pride in a legacy that colonialism tried to erase. It challenges the idea that Africa was only a land of tribes and suffering before colonial contact. Egypt is proof that Africa has always been a cradle of civilization, innovation, and spirituality. Educational efforts around Afrocentric history are gaining traction. Schools, documentaries, and community organizations are now teaching a version of Egyptian history that celebrates its African roots. This shift empowers Black youth by offering them role models and ancestral achievements that reflect their identity and heritage. Knowledge becomes a tool of liberation. The spiritual implications are equally powerful. As more people reconnect with African traditional religions, Egypt serves as a bridge between ancient and modern practices. Temples dedicated to Ma'at, ceremonies invoking Isis, and meditations on the Eye of Horus are resurfacing in contemporary African diaspora spirituality. Kemet is becoming sacred again, not as mythology, but as lived tradition. In popular culture, too, we see signs of re-Africanization. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers are drawing on Egyptian symbolism to tell stories of Black resilience and excellence. From music videos that echo temple aesthetics to fashion inspired by pharaonic regalia, Egypt is once again a symbol of Black glory. This cultural renaissance is rewriting the visual language of African identity, yet the work is far from over. Institutional biases still persist, and many academic spaces resist Afrocentric interpretations of Egypt. To counter this, continued research, cultural exchange, and education are essential. Supporting African-led archaeological missions, translating indigenous sources, and amplifying African voices in historical discourse are vital steps forward. Ultimately, embracing Egypt as part of Black heritage means honoring a civilization that spoke the language of the stars, built monuments to time, and lived in harmony with earth and spirit. It means understanding that Africa's legacy is not one of darkness and absence, but of brilliance, continuity, and light. Egypt's story is Africa's story, and it belongs to the world through the voice of Africa. Ancient Egypt, known by its native name Kemet, the Black Land, was not an isolated island of civilization in the ancient world, but a vibrant, deeply African society shaped by the people and landscapes around it. The very name Kemet referred to the dark, fertile soil of the Nile Valley, a literal and symbolic representation of life and African identity. This land was nourished by the Nile, a river that begins in the heart of Africa and flows northward, linking diverse regions like Uganda, Ethiopia, and Sudan to the Mediterranean. The people who inhabited Kemet shared deep cultural, genetic, and spiritual connections with the rest of the continent. From its earliest days, Egypt was intrinsically tied to Nubia, especially the Kingdom of Kush, located in what is now Sudan. These southern neighbors were not only trade partners and cultural allies, but sometimes rulers of Egypt itself. The earliest dynasties of Egypt show clear Nubian influence in language, symbols, and governance. Tombs and temples show figures with broad noses, full lips, and tightly coiled hair, features common in other African societies. Rather than being a separate, civilized outpost next to a primitive Africa, Egypt was a cornerstone of African civilization. The Nile River served as a highway of exchange, not only of goods, but also of ideas, beliefs, and people. This vital artery allowed Egypt to flourish while staying in constant dialogue with other African regions. Festivals, religious practices, and even artistic styles show signs of southern influence, especially during times of Nubian rule. The flow of the Nile mirrored the flow of culture. Both were constant, dynamic, and deeply African. To ignore this is to miss the soul of Egypt. Western scholars have long tried to portray Egypt as an anomaly, African in geography, but not in culture. This view stems from colonial and Eurocentric ideologies that sought to separate African peoples from the legacies of greatness. Such interpretations denied the obvious African characteristics seen in the art, language, and rituals of Kemet. Yet, a closer, honest look reveals a civilization deeply tied to the rest of Africa, both physically and spiritually. The racial depictions found in original Egyptian art, far from the whitewashed images of Hollywood or 19th century European museums, include a wide range of African skin tones. From dark brown to jet black, these depictions align with the diversity of peoples found across the continent. Some figures even bear traditional African hairstyles and clothing styles similar to those found among the Maasai, the Yoruba, or the Dinka. Egypt's elite and commoners alike reflected the continent they belonged to. Moreover, Egypt's historical memory, recorded in hieroglyphs and preserved in oral traditions, speaks often of alliances, marriages, and conflicts with African neighbors. The spiritual philosophies, rituals, and moral codes were influenced by a Pan-African worldview that valued harmony with nature, respect for ancestors, and the cyclical rhythm of life and death. This African worldview formed the moral spine of Kemetic society and resonated through its temples, pyramids, and sacred texts. In the 25th dynasty, the Kushite pharaohs rose to power and ruled as saviors of Egypt's ancient traditions. These so-called Black pharaohs revitalized Kemetic religion and temple building, emphasizing African unity and spiritual renewal. They weren't outsiders invading a foreign land. They were fellow Africans reclaiming their shared cultural heritage. Their reign is a striking reminder that Egypt and Nubia were two branches of the same tree. By recognizing Kemet as a part of Black Africa, we restore the dignity of African history and challenge the narrative that greatness must come from outside the continent. Egypt was no outlier. It was the brilliant flame of a much larger African fire. Its influence stretched far and wide, and its heart beat in rhythm with the rest of the continent. Today, there is a growing movement to re-Africanize the story of Egypt. Scholars, artists, and spiritual leaders are reclaiming Egypt as part of Africa's cultural and historical continuum. The temples of Luxor and Karnak, the writings of Ptahhotep and Imhotep, and the rituals of Isis and Osiris are now being reinterpreted through African-centered lenses. This work is essential to healing historical erasure. To see Egypt as African is not revisionism, it is truth. And that truth has the power to inspire pride, unity, and renewed understanding of Africa's profound role in shaping human civilization. The story of creation in ancient Egypt is rooted in water, a theme deeply familiar to many African traditions. The Egyptian concept of Nun, the infinite dark waters of chaos, serves as the primordial source from which everything arises. From Nun comes Atum, the self-created God, who generates the first divine pair and sets into motion the cosmic order. This echoes cosmologies across Africa, where water is revered as the origin of life and the medium through which divine will is made manifest. In Yoruba mythology, the supreme god Olodumare sends the Orisha Obatala to create land from the watery abyss. In the Dogon tradition of Mali, the world also emerges from watery chaos through the work of spiritual beings. These stories, while culturally distinct, share a foundational belief in water as the mother of all things, a sacred, living force that predates the earth itself. Egypt's cosmogony fits seamlessly within this larger African metaphysical framework. The idea of a universe born not through violence, but through divine emergence is also telling. In contrast to other ancient mythologies where creation results from battle or dismemberment, African cosmogonies often depict creation as a harmonious unfolding. Adam's act of creation is intimate, almost contemplative, a divine breath, a spit, a word spoken into the void. This peaceful birthing of existence underscores a worldview where life is sacred, intentional, and interconnected. Furthermore, the earliest temples in Egypt were built to honor the sacred waters. Shrines near the Nile symbolized Nun, and ritual baths reflected the waters of creation. Priests would purify themselves in these basins before ceremonies, reenacting the divine process of emergence from chaos into order. These practices were not symbolic alone. They were spiritual acts grounded in a continental reverence for water. Cosmogony also structured social and moral life. Just as Atum brought order to the universe, so too were humans called to uphold Ma'at, the principle of balance, justice, and truth. Similar moral philosophies are found throughout Africa, such as Ubuntu in southern Africa, emphasizing human interconnectedness, or the Akan concept of Nyame Nti, trust in divine harmony. Egypt's cosmogony was thus both a story of beginnings and a guide for ethical living. Egypt's sacred texts, like the pyramid texts and coffin texts, described creation in poetic language, blending myth with ritual instruction. These texts served not only as metaphysical blueprints, but as tools for spiritual transformation. Reciting them was an act of participation in the cosmic cycle, just as in African griot traditions. Oral stories are performative and transformative acts. In many African societies, the earth is considered a living being, born of the divine waters and sustained through human stewardship. The land is not owned, but honored. This belief is evident in Egypt as well, where the Nile's cycles dictated agriculture, festivals, and even temple construction. The natural world was not separate from the divine. It was the divine. The similarities across African cosmogonies suggest a shared ancestral wisdom, preserved and adapted over millennia. Egypt did not borrow from Africa. It contributed to and grew from the same